The September sun blazed mercilessly over Cedar Ridge, a dust-covered town barely clinging to existence at the edge of the Colorado Territory. Margaret Maggie O'Brien stood at the window of the small Presbyterian church, her ivory silk wedding dress catching the harsh afternoon light like captured moonbeams. The dress had been her mother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit her slender frame, with delicate pearl buttons running down the back and intricate lace sleeves that had taken months to repair. "He'll be here, dear," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, patting Maggie's trembling hand with weathered fingers. "Thomas is a good man. There must be a reasonable explanation." But Maggie's blue eyes remained fixed on the empty dirt road that stretched toward the horizon, where heat waves danced like ghosts above the scrubland. The wedding was supposed to begin at 2 o'clock. It was now past 4, and the small gathering of townspeople shifted uncomfortably in the wooden pews, their Sunday best wilting in the oppressive heat. Thomas Whitmore had promised her everything: a future away from the harsh frontier life, a home in Denver where she could teach children and he could expand his business ventures. They'd met 8 months ago when he'd arrived in Cedar Ridge to purchase cattle from her father's struggling ranch. Tall, well-dressed, with kind brown eyes and a gentle manner that stood out sharply against the rough cowboys and miners who frequented their town. "Perhaps we should—" Reverend Henderson began softly. "No!" Maggie's voice was barely audible, but firm. "He's coming. Something's happened. His horse or bandits on the trail from Denver. He's coming." The church had been decorated with wild prairie roses and sagebrush, the only flowers available in this unforgiving landscape. Maggie had spent days gathering them with her younger sister Sarah, dreaming of the moment Thomas would see her walking down the aisle. Now the flowers were wilting, their pink petals dropping like tears onto the dusty floor. Her father, Patrick O'Brien, approached with heavy steps that echoed in the silence. His face, weathered by years of fighting the elements to keep their ranch alive, showed a mixture of anger and pity that cut through Maggie's heart like a knife. "Maggie, girl," he said in his thick Irish accent, his calloused hand resting on her shoulder, "it's time we faced facts. The man isn't coming." "He is." She spun around, her dress rustling with the sudden movement. "You never liked him because he wasn't one of your rough cowboys, because he had education and prospects beyond this God-forsaken place." "I didn't like him because something about him didn't sit right," Patrick replied, his voice gentle despite his words. "A man who truly loves a woman doesn't leave her standing at the altar. Circumstances be damned." The small crowd began to disperse, murmuring sympathetic words that felt like salt in Maggie's wounds. Sarah, only 16 but wise beyond her years, took her sister's hand. "Come home, Maggie. Ma's got supper waiting," and "No." Maggie pulled away, gathering up the train of her dress. "I'm going to the cabin, our cabin, the one Thomas bought for us on Miller's Creek. If something's happened to him, if he's hurt or delayed, that's where he'll come looking for me." The cabin sat 3 miles outside of town, a modest 2-room structure that Thomas had purchased and furnished for their married life. Maggie had visited it only once, chaperoned by her mother, but she remembered every detail: the stone fireplace, the simple wooden furniture, the view of the creek through the single window. "Maggie, please," her mother pleaded, her Irish accent thickened with emotion. "Come home where you belong. This foolishness will only bring you more pain." But Maggie was already walking toward her horse, her wedding dress trailing in the dirt. The weight of everyone's pity and the growing certainty in their eyes that Thomas Whitmore had abandoned her only strengthened her resolve. She would wait for him. She would prove them all wrong. As she rode through the fading daylight toward Miller's Creek, the Colorado wind whipped her veil around her face like a ghost's embrace. Behind her, the town of Cedar Ridge grew smaller, its oil lamps beginning to flicker to life in the gathering darkness. Ahead lay only the vast, indifferent wilderness and a small cabin where she would begin her vigil. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her painfully of the sunset Thomas had described to her once when he spoke of the view from his hotel room in Denver. "Someday," he had said, "we'll watch sunsets like that together from our own porch, far from all this dust and hardship." Maggie urged her horse faster, her wedding dress now streaked with dirt and sweat. She would wait for him. She would wait for their someday. The cabin stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky like a lonely sentinel. Maggie dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the ride, her wedding dress now a sorry sight of dust and wrinkles. But she didn't care. She fumbled for the key Thomas had given her, a simple iron key that had symbolized so much hope just that morning. Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh wood and the faint scent of the wildflowers Thomas had placed in a mason jar on the table during their single visit. The furniture was exactly as she remembered. A simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dining table with 2 chairs, and the stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Maggie lit the oil lamp with trembling fingers, its warm glow pushing back the darkness that seemed to press against the single window like a living thing. She could hear the creek babbling nearby, and somewhere in the distance a coyote's lonesome howl echoed across the prairie. She sat heavily in one of the chairs, still wearing her wedding dress, and stared at the empty chair across from her. This was where Thomas should be sitting now, where they should be sharing their first meal as husband and wife. Instead, there was only silence and the growing ache in her chest that felt like a physical wound. "He's just delayed," she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible over the creek's murmur. "Men get delayed all the time out here. Indians, bandits, a lame horse." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in like the night chill seeping through the cabin's gaps. Thomas was an experienced traveler, careful and well prepared. He had promised to arrive in Cedar Ridge 2 days before the wedding to make final preparations. Instead, he had never come at all. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Maggie found herself jumping at every sound, the creak of settling wood, the rustle of wind through the sagebrush, the splash of a beaver in the creek. Each time her heart would race, with the hope that she would hear hoofbeats, would hear Thomas calling her name. Each time, she was disappointed. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, as it always did in the high desert. Maggie wrapped her arms around herself, but refused to change out of her wedding dress or even remove her veil. To do so would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that this day had ended in failure rather than celebration. She tried to eat some of the simple provisions Thomas had stocked, hardtack, jerky, canned peaches, but everything tasted like sawdust. Her stomach was clenched too tightly with anxiety and heartbreak to accept food. Instead, she sat by the window, straining her eyes to see through the darkness, watching for any sign of an approaching rider. As the night wore on, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Here she was, a 22-year-old woman alone in the wilderness, wearing a wedding dress that felt increasingly like a costume from a play that had been cancelled mid-performance. The carefully planned future she had built in her mind, the house in Denver, the children she and Thomas would have, the escape from the harsh frontier life, all of it seemed to be crumbling like a sand castle before an incoming tide. "Please, God," she whispered, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window. "Please let him be safe. Please let him come." But the darkness offered no answers, only the endless symphony of night sounds that seemed to mock her vigil. Somewhere out there, wolves howled at the moon, and Maggie shivered as she remembered her father's warnings about a woman alone in the wilderness. But fear of wild animals seemed insignificant compared to the growing fear that Thomas had simply chosen not to come. She must have dozed fitfully in the chair, because she awoke to the pale light of dawn creeping through the window. Her neck ached from sleeping upright, and her wedding dress was wrinkled beyond repair, but she felt a surge of hope with the new day. Surely Thomas would come today. Surely yesterday had been just a terrible delay. Maggie stood and straightened her dress as best she could, then stepped outside to scan the horizon. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and creek water. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily above the prairie, and for a moment the beauty of the landscape almost made her forget her heartache. Almost. Because, as the sun climbed higher and the morning stretched toward noon, there was still no sign of the man she had promised to love, honor, and cherish until death parted them. The man who had apparently decided that death was not the only thing that could part them after all. But Maggie O'Brien was Irish, and the Irish were nothing if not stubborn. She would wait another day and another night. She would prove to everyone, to her family, to the townspeople, to herself, that Thomas Whitmore was worth waiting for, even if the waiting was slowly breaking her heart. The second day passed like the first, only slower and more agonizing. Maggie forced herself to eat a few bites of bread and to drink water from the creek, though every swallow felt like swallowing stones. Her wedding dress, once pristine and beautiful, now hung on her like a tattered flag of surrender. Stained with dirt and tears, she hadn't even realized she was crying. She had positioned herself by the window like a lighthouse keeper, watching for ships that would never come. Every dust devil on the horizon made her heart leap. Every shadow that might have been a horse and rider sent her rushing to the door, only to find nothing but the endless, indifferent prairie stretching away in all directions. By the afternoon of the second day, even her stubborn Irish resolve began to crack. She found herself talking aloud to fill the terrible silence, her voice growing hoarse from disuse and emotion. Maybe his business in Denver took longer than expected, she reasoned to the empty room. Maybe he sent a telegram to town, and no one thought to bring it out here. Maybe, but the maybes were becoming harder to believe, and the silence of the cabin seemed to swallow her words as quickly as she spoke them. As the second night fell, Maggie finally allowed herself to truly consider the possibility that everyone in Cedar Ridge had been right, that Thomas Whitmore had gotten cold feet or had found someone else, or had simply decided that marriage to a rancher's daughter from a dust-speck town wasn't worth the trouble after all. The thought hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over in the chair as sobs racked her body. The beautiful future she had built in her mind, their house in Denver with real glass windows and a garden, the children they would raise, the respectability and comfort he had promised her, all of it had been nothing but a cruel mirage. "How could I have been such a fool?" she whispered through her tears. "How could I have believed that a man like that would want a woman like me?" The prairie wind howled around the cabin like a pack of wolves, and for the first time since arriving, Maggie felt truly afraid. Not of wild animals or bandits, but of the yawning emptiness of her future. At 22, she was already considered practically an old maid in Cedar Ridge. Her chances of finding another husband, especially after being so publicly abandoned, were slim to none. The third day dawned grey and cold, with heavy clouds promising the first snow of the season. Maggie could feel winter approaching in her bones, and the metaphor was not lost on her. Summer was over, in more ways than one. She had stopped watching the horizon with any real hope. Instead, she sat numbly by the cold fireplace, still wearing her wedding dress, because changing out of it would require an energy and will to move forward that she simply didn't possess. The dress had become both her armor and her shroud, protecting her from reality while slowly suffocating her with false hope. Around midday, she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Maggie's heart, which had been barely beating for hours, suddenly pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She rushed to the window, pressing her face against the glass, and saw a rider approaching through the grey landscape. But as the figure drew closer, her hope turned to ash in her mouth. It wasn't Thomas. The rider was too small, too slight. It was her sister Sarah, wrapped in a heavy coat and riding their father's old gelding. "Maggie," Sarah called as she dismounted, "open the door. I've brought news." With leaden feet, Maggie walked to the door and opened it. Sarah's young face was flushed with cold and excitement, her eyes bright with something that might have been sympathy or might have been relief. "What news?" Maggie asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear it. Sarah stepped inside, shaking the cold from her coat. She looked around the cabin with wide eyes, taking in Maggie's disheveled appearance and the untouched bed. "Oh, Maggie," she whispered, "you really have been sleeping in your dress." "Tell me," Maggie said flatly. "Just tell me." Sarah took a deep breath. "Mr. Peterson came into town this morning. He'd been in Denver on business. He saw Thomas Whitmore there." Maggie felt the world tilt around her. "Saw him? When? What did he say?" "3 days ago, Maggie. The day after the wedding was supposed to happen. Thomas was at the Denver hotel, having dinner with another woman. Mr. Peterson recognized her as Elizabeth Crane, the banker's daughter from Colorado Springs. They looked very comfortable together." The words hit Maggie like bullets, each one finding its mark in her already shattered heart. 3 days ago, the day after their wedding. While she'd been sitting in this cabin in her wedding dress, crying and hoping and praying, Thomas had been dining with another woman. "There's more," Sarah continued gently. "Mr. Peterson made inquiries. Thomas and Elizabeth Crane were married yesterday in a private ceremony in Denver. She's pregnant, Maggie, has been for months." The cabin spun around Maggie like a child's top. She groped for the chair, her legs no longer able to support her weight. Pregnant. For months. Which meant that while Thomas had been courting her, while he had been promising her the world and slipping an engagement ring onto her finger, he had been sharing a bed with another woman. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her young face. "I'm so sorry, sister." But Maggie barely heard her. She was remembering every kiss, every promise, every gentle word Thomas had spoken to her. Had any of it been real? Or had she been nothing more than a convenient amusement while he waited for his real bride to arrange a wedding that would salvage her reputation? The humiliation was almost worse than the heartbreak. Everyone in Cedar Ridge would know soon, if they didn't already. Poor Maggie O'Brien, the spinster who was so desperate for a husband that she fell for the first smooth-talking stranger who paid her attention. Poor Maggie, who sat in a cabin for 3 days in her wedding dress, waiting for a man who was marrying someone else. As if, from a great distance, she heard Sarah saying something about coming home, about their parents being worried sick, about how the first snow was expected tonight and it wasn't safe to stay in the cabin alone. But Maggie wasn't listening. She was staring at her reflection in the dark window, at the woman in the ruined wedding dress who had been fool enough to believe in fairy tales. The woman she had been 3 days ago, hopeful, trusting, innocent, was as dead as if she had been buried in the town cemetery. "Maggie," Sarah said urgently, "we need to go. Now. The storm's coming and Father will have both our hides if I don't bring you home safe." Outside, the wind was picking up, and the first fat snowflakes had begun to fall. Winter was coming to the high country, and with it, the long, cold months when the O'Brien Ranch would be cut off from the rest of the world by snow and ice. Maggie looked around the cabin one last time, at the wilted flowers on the table, at the bed she had never shared, at the life she had never lived. Then she stood up, her wedding dress rustling around her like autumn leaves. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's go home." But as they prepared to leave, a new sound cut through the wind and snow, the sound of another horse approaching through the storm. Both women froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "Expecting someone else?" Sarah asked. Before Maggie could answer, a knock echoed through the cabin, firm, confident, and completely unexpected. Through the thick glass window, distorted by swirling snow, Maggie could make out the shape of a man standing on her doorstep. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but this time it wasn't with hope. It was with a mixture of dread and curiosity that made her stomach clench. "Don't answer it," Sarah whispered, moving closer to her sister. "It could be anyone. Drifters, outlaws." But something about the figure outside didn't seem threatening. The knock came again, patient but persistent, and then a voice called out through the storm. "Ma'am, I know someone's in there. I saw the lamplight. I'm not looking for trouble, just shelter from this storm. My horse is about done in." The voice was unfamiliar, deep, with a slight accent that sounded like it might be from the eastern states. Nothing like Thomas's smooth, cultured tones, but there was something honest about it that made Maggie's hand move toward the door latch before she could stop herself. "Maggie, no," Sarah hissed. "We don't know who that is." "And we'll freeze to death, wondering if we don't let him in soon," Maggie replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen to me now? My reputation is already ruined, my heart is already broken, and my dreams are already dead. A stranger at my door seems like the least of my problems." She lifted the latch and opened the door to reveal a man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat that was dusted with snow. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, as if he'd been traveling for weeks without visiting a barber. But it was his eyes that caught Maggie's attention, grey-green like the creek in winter, and looking at her with a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat to reveal more of his weathered but kind face. "Name's Daniel Murphy. I was heading to Cedar Ridge when this storm caught me. Your cabin was the only light I could see for miles." Sarah stepped protectively closer to Maggie, but the stranger, Daniel, seemed more interested in warming his hands by the cold fireplace than in threatening anyone. "I can get that going for you if you'd like," he offered, nodding toward the fireplace. "Looks like it's going to be a long, cold night, and you ladies shouldn't have to weather it without heat." "We were just leaving," Sarah said quickly. "We need to get back to town before the storm gets worse." Daniel looked out the window at the swirling snow, then back at the two women with obvious concern. "I'm afraid that storm's already gotten worse, miss. Visibility's down to nothing, and the wind's picking up something fierce. It wouldn't be safe to travel in this weather, especially not at night." As if to emphasize his point, the wind howled around the cabin with renewed fury, and the snowflakes had turned into a solid wall of white beyond the window. "But we can't stay here," Sarah protested. "It wouldn't be proper. We don't even know you." Daniel's eyes moved between the two sisters, taking in their obvious distress and Maggie's disheveled wedding dress. His expression grew thoughtful, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "I can see you ladies are in some kind of difficulty," he said carefully, "and I don't want to add to your troubles. If you're more comfortable, I can bed down in the barn with my horse. But I strongly advise against trying to travel to town in this storm. People die in weather like this." Something about his matter-of-fact concern, so different from Thomas's flowery promises, made Maggie look at him more closely. His clothes were well-made but practical, his boots were sturdy and well-traveled, and his hands showed the calluses of a man who worked for a living. Everything about him spoke of competence and reliability, qualities that suddenly seemed more attractive than all the smooth charm in the world. "Start the fire," Maggie said quietly. "Sarah and I will stay on this side of the cabin. You can take the other side. We'll make do until the storm passes." "Maggie!" Sarah protested. "It's all right," Maggie said, surprising herself with how calm she felt. "We don't have much choice, and Mr. Murphy seems trustworthy." As Daniel knelt by the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced efficiency, Maggie found herself studying him. There was something peaceful about watching him work, something steadying about his quiet competence. Within minutes, he had a cheerful blaze going, and the cabin began to warm for the first time in 3 days. "Thank you," Maggie said softly. "That's the first fire this place has seen since—" She trailed off, realizing she had almost mentioned her abandoned wedding, but Daniel seemed to understand, without explanation. "Would it be presumptuous of me to ask why a lady is sitting alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, wearing what appears to be a wedding dress?" he asked gently. Sarah shot her sister a warning look, but Maggie found herself wanting to tell this stranger the truth. Maybe it was the warmth of the fire, or the fact that he had kind eyes, or simply that she was tired of carrying the shame and humiliation alone. "I was supposed to be married 3 days ago," she said simply. "The groom didn't come." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Then the groom was a fool. The simple statement, delivered without pity or false comfort, somehow meant more than all the sympathy she had received from the townspeople. It was the first time anyone had suggested that Thomas, rather than Maggie, might be the one at fault. "You don't know me," Maggie said. "Maybe he had good reasons." "Maybe he did," Daniel agreed. "But any man worth having would have come to explain those reasons to your face, not left you wondering and waiting." He looked directly at her, and she was struck again by the honesty in his eyes. A woman deserves better than that, no matter what the circumstances. As the storm raged outside, the three of them settled into an oddly comfortable routine. Sarah dozed by the fire, exhausted from her ride and the emotional stress of the day. Daniel maintained a respectful distance while still managing to make himself useful, checking the windows for drafts, ensuring the fire stayed strong, and even preparing a simple meal from the cabin's limited supplies. And Maggie found herself talking to this stranger about things she had never discussed with anyone. About her dreams of leaving Cedar Ridge, about her fear of becoming a spinster like her Aunt Mary, about the suffocating limitations of frontier life for a woman with ambitions. "What were you planning to do in Denver?" Daniel asked, as they sat by the fire in the late hours of the night. "Teach," Maggie replied. "Thomas promised I could teach at a proper school, with real books and supplies. I've been teaching the local children when I can. But out here, there's not much call for education beyond reading and arithmetic." "Education's important," Daniel agreed, "especially for children growing up in a changing world. The frontier won't stay wild forever." "What about you?" Maggie asked. "Where are you headed?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I was coming to Cedar Ridge to look at some land, thinking about starting over somewhere new. I had a farm in Ohio, but my wife—" He paused, his expression growing distant. "She died 2 years ago in childbirth, lost the baby too. After that, the farm just felt like a tomb. So I sold everything and decided to head west." The simple honesty of his grief, so different from the elaborate speeches Thomas used to make, made Maggie's heart ache for him. Here was a man who had lost everything and was still brave enough to start over, while she had been wallowing in self-pity over a man who had never deserved her in the first place. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Thank you. It gets easier, but it never really goes away." He looked at her with understanding. "Though I imagine being deceived feels almost as bad as being bereaved. At least I know Mary loved me. You have to wonder about everything now." His insight was so accurate it took her breath away. That was exactly what hurt the most, not just the loss of Thomas, but the doubt it cast over every memory, every moment she had thought was real. "How do you start over?" she asked. "How do you trust again?" "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted, "but I figure the first step is deciding what kind of person you want to be going forward. You can let what happened make you bitter and closed off, or you can let it teach you what real love should look like." As dawn approached and the storm began to clear, Maggie realized that something had shifted inside her during the long night. The crushing weight of shame and humiliation that had been suffocating her for 3 days had lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. She was still wearing her wedding dress, but it no longer felt like a costume or a shroud. It felt like a reminder of who she had been and a symbol of who she was choosing to become. A woman who deserved better than Thomas Whitmore. A woman who was strong enough to start over. "The storm's passing," Daniel observed, looking out the window at the clearing sky. "Yes," Maggie agreed, standing and smoothing down her wrinkled skirts. "I think it is." As the three of them prepared to leave the cabin and return to Cedar Ridge, Maggie took one last look around the small space where she had learned the difference between fairy tale promises and genuine human kindness, where she had met a man who had lost everything and was still brave enough to start over. "Mr. Murphy," she said as they walked toward their horses, "that land you were looking at in Cedar Ridge, Are you still interested in settling there?" Daniel's eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been hope. "That depends, Miss O'Brien. Is Cedar Ridge the kind of place where a man can build a new life?" Maggie looked back at the cabin, where she had spent 3 days, mourning a future that had never been real, then forward toward the town where her real life was waiting to begin. "I think it might be, Mr. Murphy," she said, with the first genuine smile she had felt in days. "I think it just might be." As they rode through the clearing morning towards Cedar Ridge, Maggie realized that sometimes the best things in life came not when you were looking for them, but when you had finally stopped looking backward and started moving forward. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, full of possibilities she had never imagined. And for the first time in 3 days, Maggie O'Brien felt ready to face them all.